2. Telling a short story. 1. Like the modern novel, the modern short story seems to have originated, or at least received its present stamp, in France. English writers in this line were slower in attaining the point to which the French and Russians first carried the art. Since then, the short story has developed and reached out in fresh directions, in the hands of such novelists as Mr. Hardy, only occasionally at his best in this form, or Stevenson, James, and Conrad, all three almost unfailingly excellent in it, or Mr. Kipling, past master of the Conte, and Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, whose delightful early volumes, Noughts and Crosses, and I See Three Ships, are less known than they deserve to be. These writers had long been preceded by Scott in Wandering Willie's Tale and other short stories, by Poe, The Sporadic and Unaccountable, and by Hawthorne. But almost all the best tales of Scott, Hawthorne, and Poe belong to that peculiar category of the eerie which lies outside of the classic tradition. When the novel of manners comes to be dealt with, classification in order of time will have to be reversed, and in order of merit will be less easy. For even against Balzac, Tolstoy, and Turgenev, the genius of the great English observers, from Richardson and Jane Austen to Thackeray and Dickens, will weigh heavily in the balance. With regard to the short story, however, and especially to that compactest form of it, the short story, or conte, its first specimens are undoubtedly of continental production, but happily for English letters, the generation who took over and adapted the formula were nursed on the Goethean principle that those who remain imprisoned in the false notion of their own originality will always fall short of what they might have accomplished. The sense of form, already defined as the order, in time and importance, in which the narrated incidents are grouped, is, in all the arts, specifically of the classic, the Latin tradition. 1,000 years of form in the widest disciplinary sense, of its observance, its application, its tacit acceptance as the first condition of artistic expression, have cleared the ground for the French writer of fiction of many superfluous encumbrances. As the soil of France is of all soils the most weeded, tilled, and ductile, so the field of art, wherever French culture extends, is the most overworked and the most prepared for whatever seed is to be sown in it. But when the great Russians, who owe to French culture much more than is generally conceded, took over that neat thing, the French nouvelle, they gave it the additional dimension it most often lacked. And an early good subject, one has only to probe deep enough to come to tears, and the Russians almost always dig to that depth. The result has been to give to the short story, as French and Russian art have combined to shape it, great closeness of texture with profundity of form. Instead of a loose web spread over the surface of life, they have made it, at its best, a shaft driven straight into the heart of human experience. Though the critic no longer feels that need of classifying and subclassifying the genres which so preoccupied the contemporaries of Wordsworth, there are, in all the arts, certain local products that seem to necessitate a parenthesis. Such, in fiction, is the use of the supernatural. It seems to have come from mysterious Germanic and Armorican forests, from lands of long twilights and wailing winds, and it certainly did not pass through French or even Russian hands to reach us. Sorcerers and magic are of the South, the Mediterranean. It is not enough to believe in ghosts or even to have seen one to be able to write a good ghost story. The greater the improbability to be overcome, the more studied must be the approach, the more perfectly maintained the air of naturalness, the easy assumption that things are always likely to happen in that way. One of the chief obligations in a short story is to give the reader an immediate sense of security. Every phrase should be a signpost, and never, unless intentionally, a misleading one. The reader must feel that he can trust to their guidance. His confidence once gained, he may be lured onto the most incredible adventures, as the Arabian Nights are there to show. A wise critic once said, "You may ask your reader to believe anything you can make him believe. It is never the genii who are unreal, but only their unconvinced historian's description of them." The least touch of irrelevance, the least chill of inattention, will instantly undo the spell, and it will take as long to weave again as to get Humpty Dumpty back on his wall. The moment the reader loses faith in the author's sureness of foot, the chasm of improbability gapes. Improbability in itself, then, is never a danger, but the appearance of improbability is, unless, indeed, the tale be based on what, in my first chapter, I called pathological conditions of body or mind outside the field of normal experience. But this term, of course, does not apply to states of mind inherited from an earlier phase of race culture, such as the belief in ghosts. No one with a spark of imagination ever objected to a good ghost story as improbable, though Mrs. Barbauld, who doubtless lacked the spark, is said to have condemned The Ancient Mariner on this ground. Most of us retain the more or less shadowy memory of ancestral terrors and airy tongues that syllable men's names. We cannot believe a priori in the probability of the actions of madmen or neurasthenics, because their reasoning processes escape most of us, or can at best be imagined only as belonging to abnormal and exceptional people. But everybody knows a good ghost when he reads about him. When the reader's confidence is gained, the next rule of the game is to avoid distracting and splintering up his attention. Many a would-be tale of horror becomes innocuous through the very multiplication and variety of its horrors. Above all, if they are multiplied, they should be cumulative and not dispersed. But the fewer the better. Once the preliminary horror posited, it is the harping on the same string, the same nerve, that does the trick. Quiet iteration is far more racking than diversified assault. The expected is more frightful than the unforeseen. The play of Emperor Jones is a striking instance of the power of simplification and repetition to excite in an audience a corresponding state of tension. By sheer voodoo practice, it shows how voodoo acts. In The Turn of the Screw, which stands alone among tales of the supernatural in maintaining the ghostliness of its ghosts, not only through a dozen pages, but through close on 200, the economy of horror is carried to its last degree. What is the reader made to expect? Always, all through the book, that somewhere in that hushed house of doom, the poor little governess will come on one of the two figures of evil for whom she is fighting for the souls of her charges. It will be either Peter Quint or the horror of horrors, Miss Jessel. No diversion from this one dread is ever attempted or expected. It is true that the tale is strongly held together by its profound, its appalling moral significance, but most readers will admit that, long before they are conscious of this, fear, simple, shivering animal fear, has them by the throat, which, after all, is what writers of ghost stories are after. If you made it through that, you are amazing. I have a very bad headache today, and I can definitely tell it is affecting how I am reading today. I hope that you are able to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Bye.